Well, here we are, pleasant afternoon, late autumn, winter around the corner. Some of the birds are making a bit of a racket, but don't worry about them. Well, by the time you see this, it'll be roughly close to the end of the election campaign, and obviously you'll have made up your mind what you're going to do. And if you're a viewer to this YouTube presentation, well, you know what to do. Now, what I'm interested in looking at today is what I called Australia's cargo cult mentality. Now, I think a few people understand what a cargo cult is, but I don't think many people understand its origins. During World War II, when the American forces were island hopping across the Pacific to Japan, a huge armada of ships and planes arrived at Tanna, which was then called the New Hebrides, which is now Vanuatu, which is an island which is well known for its volcano, its active volcano. And obviously, like all islands in Vanuatu, it was inhabited by people who lived a symbiotic relationship with nature over thousands of years. Now, this invasion of aircraft and ships, mainly aircraft, obviously caused a lot of consternation among the local people. But what they saw was all these goods coming out of the planes. And when the war ended and the American forces left Tanna in Vanuatu, what had developed was what's called a cargo cult. So many of the local people believed that somehow Europeans had stolen this wealth which was due to them from the skies. And this cult was called John Frum cult. In fact, people think it was called John Frum because it was the name of a storeman, I think Afro-American storeman in the American Army. And for many years the people of Tanna were waiting for the cargo which was destined to them by their gods. And this was called a cargo cult mentality. So what does Australia have to do with cargo cult mentality? Now, I'm not talking about a cargo cult mentality in terms of our social security system, but I'm talking about a cargo cult mentality which is wrapped up in a historical amnesia. A historical amnesia which collectively forces us to repeat the same mistakes ad nauseum. Now, a lot of people have welcomed the gig economy. Basically, the gig economy is a hark back to the 19th century where there were no trade unions, no minimum wages, and people basically worked as serfs, slaves, contractors. And we think because we can get a delivery at our door in an hour or two of some type takeaway goodie, or get something off the net, that somehow this justifies the exploitation of this section of the community. And to a significant degree, this type of attitude exists because we have forgotten, consciously, unconsciously, collectively, individually, we have forgotten where many of the advantages we enjoy in this country compared to many other sovereign nation states around the world came from. Nothing, and the key word was nothing, was given to Australian workers and the Australian people without a struggle. Nothing. The struggle for a minimum wage is tied up with the Harvester decision the Sunshine Harvester decision in 1905, where a minimum wage was set. The struggle for awards in specific industries was due to the struggle of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of trade unionists. With May Day coming and going, I think the struggle of the 8-hour day highlights how important these struggles were. Now, the 8-hour day wasn't given to the Australian workers. Now, remember, this is the type of society that had children working in mines 2 centuries ago. The sectanic mills, as they were called, the woolen mills, which we fed from the lands which had been stolen from this country's First Nations people with the sheep. So getting back to the idea of, the 8-hour struggle began in 1855, initially in Sydney and then followed in Melbourne, where the stonemasons, which were the people with exceptional skills, building skills, went on strike in order to achieve an 8-hour day, 6-day week for their members. And the slogan of the 8-hour day committees were 8-hour work, 8-hour rest, 8-hour sleep. That's were the slogans. The 8-hour day did not become part and parcel of Australian life till the late 19th, early 20th century, and it took over 50 years of struggle to achieve that. Now, a lot of people think that pensions, whether they're social security pensions, old age pensions, whether they're single parents benefits, student benefits, and the list goes on, disability support pensions, come out of the blue. They didn't come out of the blue. They came from decades of struggle, political struggle, social struggle, cultural struggle. We saw the emergence of a Labor Party, which had its beginnings in the 1891 shearer strike, which went up and down the east coast of Australia. A strike that almost ended in armed insurrectionary rebellion, where many were arrested, many imprisoned. And it's these strikes and the formation of the Australian ALP over 120 years ago, as Labor moved from direct action at the workplace into parliamentary democracy, that have created many of the reforms we see today. Now, the much maligned Whitlam-led Labor government was the most reformist government in this country's history. It was the most reformist government in this country's history, not because of a Labor Party policy, but because the Labor Party was driven to reform through mass protest and mass action, and people entering the Labor Party who wanted change, significant change. And I could stand here for the next half an hour and talk about all the reforms which were introduced in a 4.5-year period before the Whitlam-led Labor government was removed from office by the Governor-General, at the behest, many people say, of the CIA, because of its reformist agenda and its agenda to actually look at nationalising this country's national resources. So we seem to have this historic amnesia, not just in terms of the way this country was created on the legal fiction of terra nullius, that the land belonged to no one, but we seem to have this cargo cult mentality as far as the situation we find ourselves in, the advantages we find ourselves with. We think somehow they've come because of largesse from government. Every change, even the plebiscite on gay marriage, came after decades of struggle. Every gain comes from struggle, and we've forgotten that. We think that by working up the right channels, that somehow things will change, that if we beg and beseech, that somehow things will change. Nothing highlights this than the mass privatisation of public assets in this country over the last 4 to 5 decades. And we now find ourselves in the ridiculous situation where we have an economic system where there is no real competition. There's no competition apart from corporate competition. And we have the ridiculous situation of 90% of small businesses failing within 5 years of their existence, because their inability to compete with a corporate sector that has total government support. So if we want change, it's not just about the ballot box. Now, I know some of you will have put one, if you're in Victoria, would have put one in the box next to my name as a Senate candidate who's pushing a reform agenda, not a revolutionary agenda or a radical agenda, but a simple reform agenda. A simple changes to the taxation system to ensure that some basics are incorporated in Australian life. Things like a universal basic income, public ownership of essential services, adequate public health care, education facilities, and the list goes on and on. And again, that's a parliamentary agenda. We are following a parliamentary agenda, but all parliamentary agendas come from struggle outside Parliament. You can't rely on the courts to provide change. The courts are there to interpret legislation. The High Court is there to interpret constitutions and laws and their relationship to the constitution of the day. That's what the High Court is about. So there are no legal shortcuts to change. There's no parliamentary road to change. Change comes through struggle for people putting up their heads above the parapet. And if you put your head up above the parapet, there's always the danger it's going to be blown off. So we need to understand the history of change. We need to understand the historical forces which are at play when change occurred. Let's not forget, in World War I, it was up to the government of the day, and another 60,000 young Australian men would have been sacrificed in the Australian killing fields if it wasn't for two plebiscites which denied the government the right to conscript males to fight in a war over. So, by the time you see this video clip, the election will be almost upon us. And obviously in the next week or so we'll know who the new government is. Whether it's the old government under Morrison's leadership, or whether it's a new government under Albanese leadership, whether it's a hung parliament, whether it's some type of coalition. We'll most likely know the result. But that's not the end of the matter. And that's the problem with electoral politics. And although I stood as Senate candidate in Victoria as an ungrouped independent, I'm well aware of the shortcomings of the parliamentary system. Well aware of the fact that most of the legislation which goes through Parliament basically suits the interest of that 1% that owns the means of production, distribution and communication, and that 8 to 9% who have excess income to invest. I'm well aware of that. So in the next 3 years post-election, it's important that we continue those day-to-day struggles, because it's people like us who continue those struggles in between elections which determine the parliamentary agenda, which determine which reforms will become a reality, which will determine whether universal basic income will become a reality, the public ownership of essential services will become a reality, whether the Uluru Statement from the Heart becomes a reality. That is the key. It's that continuing struggle in between elections. When you're asked to cast a ballot to vote representatives into office to represent you over the next 3 to 4 year period at a federal and state level. I mean, that is just a blink of an eye in that 3 year period, that 1,000 days in between elections. It's a blink of an eye. And whether you want the same bland, boring, inane policies up again in 2025, or whether you want policies which will at least deal with many of the problems we face as a community based to increasing inequality, based due to the climate emergency. Whether we deal with these situations or not, to a significant degree, will depend on the type of action we take over the next 3 years. So election eve and the election day and the day or two after it when results are compiled is not the pinnacle of democracy. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, And most importantly of all, it is by an engaged public. To think that a democratic duty is to cast a ballot every 3 to 4 years is ludicrous. Our duty to ourselves, our friends, our neighbours, our family, our communities, even our regions and states and the country as a whole, is that duty which we exercise in between elections, irrespective of the laws that have been passed that criminalises dissent in this country. Irrespective of the government that is in power, the issues will remain. We'll continue to have a private charity trying to raise money to send Australian kids to public schools, which are theoretically 3. We'll continue to have 1.2 million children living in poverty. We'll continue to have growing inequality. We'll continue to have most of the problems we have today unless we are willing to organise in between elections. So learn about your past, learn about your history, learn about the successes and failures of past struggles, and use those lessons to create that spirit that is required to create a more egalitarian community in this country. Irrespective of technological innovations, the issues are the same. Inequalities in power and wealth. If you are interested in pursuing these issues, I ask you to seriously think about joining public interests before corporate interests. You can join online. You can join by downloading an application form and sending it to us, or you can always give me a ring on 0439 395 489, and I can actually send out application forms if you not have access to a printer. So think about it. Elections is one day in a 1,000-day period. One day. What is and what isn't policy at the next federal election, what is and what isn't